Now, before we get into the Civil War, let's go ahead and take a look at racial conflict that was happening in Texas. In Texas, you're going to also see Mexican Americans losing their land. Part of the reason for this land loss was because of the Texas Constitution itself, right? Its state constitution. And so this constitution stated that if lands were vacated, then those lands were open and could be sold to Anglo-Americans. Now the problem is a lot of Mexican Americans were forced off of their lands either through threat or through violence, and because they abandoned those lands, all of a sudden it became legal for those lands to be sold to Anglo-Americans. So that's one way, through intimidation and through violence, that Mexican Americans lost their land in Texas. Another way that the Texas Constitution led to land loss was because it stated that if an individual did not participate in the Texas Revolution, which some Mexican Americans did, but some did not, they also could lose their lands. Also, another part of the Texas Constitution was that if anybody supported Mexico during the Texas Revolution, then they also could lose their lands. And there were some individuals who at least could be accused of supporting Mexico during that conflict, and so that led to more land loss. Another example of violence towards Tejanos in Texas was the cart war. In Texas, one of the more lucrative industries was the carting industry. Here you have a picture of what one of these carts would look like. And so this was an industry that was dominated by Tejanos and as well as by Mexicans. And so this industry was all about transporting ranching goods from southern Texas and the area of San Antonio as well to the eastern part of Texas, right, to the coast. And so you had to transport a number of goods like hides, tallow, and all other goods that was coming from these ranches. Remember, ranching at this time in Texas was the biggest industry in the state. And so there was a lot of money in transporting these goods. And the reason why Mexican Americans dominated this carting industry was because they charged very low prices. And so Anglo-Americans wanted to get involved, and they were trying to break into the carting industry, but they weren't able to because they didn't lower their prices as low as Mexican Americans. And so eventually you'll see Anglo-Americans attacking these Mexican American cartmen. And so sometimes there would be physical violence, sometimes they would just steal the goods that were being transported, or sometimes their carts of Mexican Americans would be destroyed. And so all of this eventually led to the downfall of the participation of Mexican Americans in the cart industry, right? And so this was the cart war that took place. And the thing is with this cart war is that Anglo-Americans who were involved in all of this harassment and violence were never persecuted by any of the legal authorities, right? So there were no legal repercussions for them. They pretty much had free reign to attack Mexican Americans and destroy their carts, take their goods, and commit acts of violence. As in California, you will see resistance by Mexican Americans to all of this racial oppression that was existing in the state. One of the main examples of resistance was the Cortina War. The Cortina War is named after Juan Cortina. Juan Cortina was a fairly wealthy landowner, Mexican-American landowner in southern Texas. The conflict started when Cortina stood up for an old vaquero, an old cowboy who was being brutalized by the sheriff of Brownsville, which was where this all started in Texas, Brownsville, Texas. And so the sheriff, whose name was Robert Shears, was beating a Mexican American, and so Cortina decided to step in. He knew the guy. The old man had once worked for him, so Cortina steps in, and he ends up shooting Robert Shears. Okay, who was the sheriff of Brownsville in Texas. And so eventually this is going to lead to violence. Cortina, a couple months later, will return to Brownsville with a number of men, about 70 men, and they will harass various individuals and pretty much commit some acts of violence on Anglo-Americans in that area. Now, Texas will retaliate by commissioning the Texas Rangers to go and fight against Cortina and his men, and there will be several different skirmishes that will occur. Eventually, when the Civil War breaks out, Juan Cortina will support the Union Army, that's the North, during that Civil War conflict. He will get into a couple of battles with officials in Texas, but eventually he will leave Texas and go into Mexico as he is defeated in one of these battles. While in Mexico, Cortina actually has a number of different adventures. At the time, the French had invaded Mexico and had taken over the government, and there was a war going on between Mexico and France. And so Cortina, as he flees into Mexico from Texas, will get involved in this war. He goes back and forth. Sometimes he's fighting for Mexico, another time he's fighting for the French, actually. Eventually goes back to supporting Mexico. And so he has a long history there in Mexico as well. Eventually he will begin acting out as a bandit, and it was said, at least rumored, that he was sending individuals from Mexico into Texas to conduct raids on the properties of large landowners in Texas, and then these raiders would eventually go back into Mexico. And so this was happening for a long period of time, and so you had Texas working with Mexico eventually, like putting pressure on Mexico to capture Juan Cortina, and eventually they did, and they put him in jail in Mexico City for banditry. But eventually he was let go. I mean, at this time he was an older man. He was just put on house arrest, and he spent the rest of his days on house arrest. But Cortina is just really a major example of Mexican Americans who fought back against the racial oppression that was being experienced by Mexican Americans in Texas.